Hello, dear warriors. They thought they had seen it all. Serial offenders, domestic threats, rogue agents. But then you showed up. No record, no pattern, no trigger, just presence. And that scared them more than any act of violence ever could. You didn't scream for attention. You didn't lash out. You didn't threaten. You were still, too still. And the stillness was the first red flag. See, the truly dangerous don't wave guns. They walk in silence. They smile just enough. They pass every test. But inside, they're running simulations, reading rooms, measuring threats. FBI profilers built entire systems to categorize deviants. But you didn't fit any, because you weren't reacting. You were calculating. They interviewed people like you before, but by the time they realized what they were dealing with, it was already over. They said, don't engage, because to engage meant to be pulled into a vortex of control, of logic, of power. They couldn't map. What happens when the system meets someone who can read its patterns faster than its own analysts? Panic. That's what happens. Not because you're violent, but because you don't need to be. Because your weapon is invisibility. Because your profile is unclassifiable. They ran the scans, facial expression analysis, heart rate variability, thermal mapping. Everything said the same thing. This subject does not react normally. You didn't flinch. Not even once. And that scared them. They're trained to look for cracks, micro movements, eye flickers, tension in the jaw. But you gave them nothing. Because you weren't confused. You weren't even angry. You were just done pretending. See, when you've been underestimated your whole life, you learn to watch in silence. You learn to study their moves before making yours. And by the time they realize you're playing chess, they're still holding checker pieces. One profiler said, "This one isn't here to explain himself." He was right. You didn't walk into life asking for validation. You didn't need applause. You weren't waiting for anyone's permission. You weren't raised in darkness. You were forged by it. They saw discipline, but mistook it for detachment. They saw silence, but called it cold. They saw distance, but never noticed the precision behind it. You never needed them to understand you. In fact, it's better if they don't, because when they don't understand something, they fear it. And when they fear something they can't control, they whisper warnings behind closed doors. Don't engage. They tried to provoke you, poke the beast, push buttons they thought you had, but you just stared. Calm, unblinking, unbreakable. Because they didn't know. You weren't fighting the urge to attack. You were controlling the monster you trained for years to silence. They called in a senior profiler, ex-military, used to interrogation rooms. He sat across from you and said, "I've seen warlords blink. Why won't you?" You didn't reply. You didn't smile. You didn't even nod. Because you weren't there to play a role. You weren't some script they could decode. You were the glitch in the system, the ghost in the blueprint. You learned long ago. Your silence is your signature. Your lack of reaction is louder than any scream. And deep down, they knew something the others didn't. That your power wasn't your strength. It was your restraint, the rage behind your calm. That's what shook them. Because when a storm stays silent, you don't relax. You prepare for impact. One whispered to another, "This one isn't unstable. He's too stable." It's terrifying. You weren't there to fit in. You were there to show them what happens when someone outgrows fear. They didn't understand your discipline because they've never had to chain a demon inside their own mind. You walk like a civilian, but your soul, it's military grade, trained in chaos, calibrated by pain. You don't flinch at threats, you flinch at kindness, because you've seen what comes after the smile. You've learned that warm hands often hide sharp knives. They watched your breathing pattern. They analyzed pupil dilation. They measured heartbeat and blink frequency. You know what the report said? This individual exhibits 0 indicators of fear. 0. That's why they stepped back. You weren't acting fearless. You were born in fear, raised by it, molded into something even fear didn't want to face anymore. They ran you through simulation after simulation, stress tests, interrogation drills, and every time you walked out colder, sharper. You weren't breaking, you were calculating, learning what not to say, and when to disappear. Because the real weapon isn't violence, it's control, and you've mastered it. That's why they stamped your file with a single sentence. Do not engage, unknown threat level. They thought you were broken because you were quiet. But silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. You listened to the noise, you heard their doubts, you watched the betrayals, and said nothing, because you don't fight like the rest. You fight when it matters. They tracked your history, and it terrified them. No meltdowns, no breakdowns, just patternless resilience. You vanished when most people cry. You smiled when most collapse. And that smile wasn't peace. It was calm before the reckoning. They sent their best to observe you, and their reports came back. Subject thinks in layered structures, non-linear, unpredictable, hyper-adaptive. Translation? You don't follow the script. You rewrite it, because this world tried to tame you, and all it did was sharpen your fangs. You weren't raised to destroy, but now destruction knows your scent, and it follows you like a soldier awaiting command. They can't engage with what they can't define, and that's why you are their threat. Not because of what you do, but because of what you don't reveal. You're not a case study. You're the variable that collapses the whole equation. They sat in rooms with two-way mirrors, analyzing your patterns, studying your movements, searching for something, anything, to explain you. But there were no patterns, no emotional tells, no fear to weaponize. You didn't fit in their boxes because you burned every box you were put in. And when the questions came, you didn't flinch. You stared back, and they felt it. That quiet, bone-deep truth. You don't fear them. You're not waiting for permission. You don't want their approval. You just want your peace. And when peace is denied, you become the reason people lock their doors in daylight. They tried to diagnose you, tried to label you, tried to reduce you to a checklist of symptoms. But warriors like you don't break. You bend reality around your pain. They thought rage would be your weakness, but you weaponized it with discipline, with cold calculation. They said, don't engage, because engagement means consequences, not screaming, not chaos. but silence, followed by absolute precision. You don't start wars, but you sure as hell know how to end them. And when you move, the system trembles, because they finally understand. You were never meant to be understood. You were built to be felt. They watched you, not because they cared, but because they feared what you might become if left unchained. They said, this one doesn't react like the others. He doesn't run. He doesn't beg. He doesn't fold. You made them uncomfortable. Because your silence was loud, because your stillness screamed, they couldn't find your weakness, because you buried it. You trained it. You turned it into fuel. Every heartbreak, recycled. Every betrayal, rewired. Every failure, filed away in the chamber, waiting to be fired back at the world that doubted you. They said, don't engage, because deep down, they knew. Engagement means war, and you don't play games you're not ready to end. You don't chase power. You become it. Not by shouting, but by sharpening your discipline, stacking quiet wins, and building an empire in the shadows. They expected a meltdown. Instead, they got a storm. No noise, just lightning. They thought silence meant weakness. They never realized silence is strategy. It's the sound of calculation, of patterns forming in the dark. While they celebrated your downfall, you were downloading the blueprint, not for revenge, but for domination. You were never broken. You were being reforged. Every insult became a trigger. Every rejection became a ritual. They mocked your stillness, but that was your metamorphosis. Because when the lion stops roaring, it's because the kill is near. You weren't hiding. You were programming a new operating system. Colder, sharper, unreadable. FBI profilers couldn't label you. Psychiatrists couldn't decode you. Even your enemies couldn't figure out if you were recovering or reloading. Truth is, you were never interested in validation. You were obsessed with precision. They fear you now, not because of what you say, but because you don't have to say anything at all. They kept asking, how did we miss it? How did we not see it coming? Because you weren't loud, you were lethal. See, weak minds show off. Strong minds study. But monsters, they adapt, quietly. You walked into rooms they said you'd never survive in, and rearranged the entire hierarchy. Not with noise, but with moves no one even saw coming. They gave you names, called you unstable, obsessive, too intense, too quiet, too real. What they didn't know was that every label they gave you, you turned into fuel. Not gasoline, rocket fuel. You didn't grow despite the pain. You grew because of it. You trained your mind like a blade, cutting through lies, fake friends, lazy patterns, and societal programming. You became so clear. You became unreadable. Now, they don't talk about you. They whisper, because the idea of you intimidates them. You're not angry. You're aware. You're not emotional. You're efficient. You're not lost. You're just not wasting time anymore. They couldn't explain you, because you stopped trying to explain yourself. They used to study your weaknesses. Now they study your distance. Not because you vanished, But because you evolved beyond recognition, you stopped reacting, and in that silence, you became unreadable, unstoppable, unforgiving. You don't chase approval anymore. You don't seek permission. You don't explain your soul to civilians, because civilians don't survive wars. Warriors do. And while they scroll, while they gossip, while they measure their worth in filters and likes, you've been building empires from scars, alone, unnoticed, unbothered. You don't want revenge, you want distance, because distance is power, silence is power, and control over your emotions, that's nuclear. They told each other you were broken. Now they say, don't engage. Not out of disrespect, but out of fear. They saw the storm in your stillness, and you don't need applause. You need results. You need your discipline. You need your madness. The part of you that never asked for a crown, because you were born to rule without one. The file's closed now, but you just opened your own. This isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of their regret. Now go. Be dangerous. Be silent. Be the anomaly they never recovered from.